The whole world died 22 years ago. Not a single light, not a single engine running. The silence is so thick it presses against his ears. And into this deathly silence falls a man who has spent 10 years repairing turbines and can sense metal with his hands. He places his palm on the rusty machine and realizes this colossus is still alive. It can be awakened. But first, Dan Crow opens his eyes and sees strange stars, too bright, too close, not a single trace of an airplane in the sky. He lies in wet leaves at the bottom of a ravine and doesn't understand why the silence sounds so loud. There is no hum of the highway, no rumble of the engine, not even the electrical hum from the power lines he'd grown so used to he'd stopped noticing it. And then white letters flash before his eyes. Industry system online. Connection to operator successful. He blinks. The letters don't fade. A grid of data flickers at the edge of his consciousness. Temperature, humidity, wind. The dashboard feels as if it's been sewn right into his skull. And he clearly remembers the ice on the roof in Ohio. He remembers how his foot slipped sideways. He remembers the starry sky rushing toward him. He remembers that he didn't finish his coffee. Now he's sitting in a strange forest, and the glowing letters welcome him to the network. Dan stands up. He brushes off the leaves. He heads toward the dim glint of metal between the trees, because a wet ravine is the surest way to get sick in any of the worlds. An old forest. Dense. Beneath branches that haven't been cleared in years crunch beneath his feet. 20 minutes later, he comes out to a rusty gate. The gate leaves hang crookedly, a sign in an unfamiliar language. But the grid in his head flashes. Object number 7. Industrial complex. Status: abandoned. Last activity: 22 years ago. Beyond the gate, birch trees have sprouted through the cracked asphalt. Long brick buildings with broken windows, rusty pipes, the collapsed roof of the workshop, and the boiler room. A huge pipe juts above the treetops like a finger pointing at the sky. Dan freezes. 10 years at the thermal power plant taught him to recognize boiler rooms with his eyes closed. By silhouette, by the layout of the buildings. This plant was built by people who knew their stuff. Boiler room, machine room, repair shop, warehouse. Everything is in its place. Everything is dead. He walks the grounds in an hour. The grid illuminates the objects with a blue outline and scatters fragments. Turbine hall. 2 units, inoperative. Transformer substation, inoperative. Artesian well, depth 120 meters. And this is where the strangest part begins. Dan places his hand on the frame and feels it. Not with his eyes or his fingers, with something new. Every mechanism tells its own story. This bearing was replaced twice, and both times it was done crookedly. This pipe was patched with tin when it should have been welded. This shaft is still straight, still functional. It can still be saved. To the locals, it's witchcraft. To Dan, it's like reading the medical chart of a sick but living patient. The grid displays a line. Power. Rank D. Meter. Kilowatt hours delivered to consumers. 0. He smirks. Rank D. Handyman. Well, well. You have to start somewhere. The gatehouse is the only one with an intact roof. A table, a broken chair, an iron box in the corner. The lock is rusted and gives way with a single blow from a stone. Inside are keys, screwdrivers, pliers, a coil of copper wire, and a light bulb. An ordinary light bulb with a tungsten filament. The bulb is intact. Dan turns it in his hands. A light bulb in a dead world. He puts it back. He picks up the wrench. It has good weight to it, good steel. 10 years elbow deep in grease, thousands of night shifts, hundreds of emergency starts. None of it has gone anywhere. He doesn't know where he is, doesn't know what kind of system is flickering in his head. But he has a wrench and a dead factory, which means there's work. At night, he sleeps on tarps. It's rough. The forest rustles with unfamiliar sounds. Somewhere far away, a wolf howls. And the grid hums even in his sleep. And this humming is strange, because the real transformers here are dead. Nothing works, but something is humming. Not in the guardhouse, not at the plant, deeper, under his feet, as if the earth itself is vibrating at a frequency only he can hear. Dan lies there and listens, and thinks that if this is madness, at least it's interesting. In the morning, he makes a list: water, food, light, information. He underlines the word people twice. Then he goes to the machine room. 2 units stand like dead giants in a rust-red crust. The roof has caved in over the left one, and a birch tree has grown inside the casing. But the right one is under an intact roof. Dan places his palm on the frame and closes his eyes. A steam turbine, 200 kilowatts. The shaft is slightly bent. The bearings need replacing. 70% of the blades are intact. The condenser is clogged. But he opens his eyes. But it's alive. Beneath the rust and 22 years of neglect, this turbine can still work. Not now, not tomorrow, but after a month of proper repairs, it will generate power again. Dan strokes the frame the way one strokes a sick horse. It's nothing. We'll fix it. On the second day, he finds a stream. The water cascades down a 2-meter stone step, a small waterfall, enough to turn the wheel. Dan rummages through the junk in the repair shop: a bicycle frame without wheels, a sheet of metal, a car alternator the size of a fist. He puts his hand on it. 12 volts. The brushes are 80% worn down. The windings are intact. The brushes. Dan looks at the pile of coal by the boiler room, then at the copper wire. Coal and copper shavings. Classic small-town America, where the nearest auto parts store is 100 miles away. For 2 hours, he cuts and shapes homemade brushes from compressed coal and copper. His hands remember. His fingers know. By noon, the generator is assembled. The bicycle frame becomes the base. He welds on the pedals. A chain, a gear. It turns into a bicycle generator. Ugly, crooked, functional. Dan sits down and pedals. The generator hums. The meter reads 11 and 6 volts. Unstable, but it's there. He screws a light bulb onto the wires, pedals again. The filament glows a dim yellow. Dan stops, takes his hands off the handlebars, stares at that light bulb. The first light in a dead world. And the counter in his head trembles. 0.001 kilowatt hours. A trifle. Dust. But no longer zero. On the third day, a girl comes to the gate, skinny, dirty, her hair cut with a knife. Her fingers are burned. She stands and stares at Dan like a cornered animal, ready to run. Dan sits on the step and repairs the pump seal with a piece of belt. He doesn't look up. He says that if she's hungry, there are nuts and water in the guardhouse. The girl doesn't move. She stands there for 10 minutes. Then she walks past. He hears her eating, quickly and greedily, like someone who hasn't eaten in a day. When she comes out, he asks her name. Lena Voss. He nods. He says his name is Dan and that he needs help. Lena looks at him suspiciously. Someone to pedal the bike? Disappointment flashes across her face. Just another job for just another adult. Dan silently carries out the bike generator, sets it in front of her, plugs in the light bulb, says one word. Pedal. Lena sits down. Pedals. The filament flickers. It warms up. It lights up. A dim yellow light in the middle of the day. Lena stops. The light goes out. She pedals again. The light flares up. She can't take her eyes off the glass bulb. It's the first light she's created herself, not the landlord's kerosene lamp, not a candle someone else pays for. Her legs turn the crank, and the light burns. She stops, and the light goes out, and tears stream down her cheeks. And she whispers, "It's me. I'm the one doing this. It's me." Dan stands in the corner, motionless, and he thinks that this is probably why he ended up in this world. By evening, Lena is still at the factory. She didn't say she'd stay. She just didn't leave. Dan gives her half the tarps. He goes back to the pump. The artesian well is the key to everything. No water, no steam. No steam, no turbine. No turbine, no real electricity. By nightfall, he lowers a primitive hand pump into the well and pumps the lever. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 12th pump, water gushes out. Rusty, murky, but water. He keeps pumping until it runs clear. Lena watches. He says that tomorrow they'll make a filter. She asks why. Clean water is the first thing you need to live. Second is heat. Third is light. And he's going to give all of that to the people around here. Lena asks, which people? Dan waves his hand toward the forest. Anyone. Everyone who comes. Lena is silent. But he notices that she has stopped looking toward the gate. The first week was spent working. Dan woke up at dawn and went to bed after sunset. Lena followed him like a shadow. She didn't help unless asked, but she watched. She memorized. On the 4th day, he assembled a water filter out of sand, charcoal, and a clay pot he'd found in the administrative building. Water from the well passed through 3 layers and came out clean. The mesh confirmed it. Safe to drink. On the 5th day, he found a barrel of motor oil in the basement of the repair shop. Old, thick, but oil. He poured it into a smaller container and began lubricating the bearings of the right turbine. One by one, slowly and carefully. He disassembled each bearing first, cleaned it with a rag made from scraps of tarpaulin, checked the balls, lubricated them, put them back together. The display showed the status of each unit with color indicators. Red meant dead. Yellow meant bad but functional. Green meant normal. By the end of the 5th day, half the bearings had gone from red to yellow. Progress. Lena spoke on the 6th day. Before that, she'd only said with yes and no. But on the 6th day, she walked up to Dan as he was crouching in front of the generator and asked what that thing inside was. He explained. Rotor, stator, winding, magnetic field. When the rotor spins in a magnetic field, a current is generated in the winding. Simple. Lena listened, tilting her head. Then she asked why the current is generated. Dan looked at her. First-year students asked that question, and most of them forgot the answer within a week. He began to explain. Electrons, conductor, field lines. Lena listened without interrupting. Her eyes were attentive and sharp, like someone used to remembering things the first time, because there might not be a second explanation. When he finished, she paused, and then said she wanted to learn. Dan nodded. He said he would teach her, but not today. Today he needed her to go into the woods and gather as many dry branches as she could carry. Lena left and returned an hour later with a bundle of kindling that was bigger than she was. He didn't praise her. He just said thank you and showed her where to put it. She nodded. That was enough. On the 7th day, Dan decided to explore the stream in earnest. He walked 1.5 miles upstream along it. The stream emerged from beneath a rocky slope. Good flow. The flow meter showed a flow rate of about 80 liters per minute. The head over 200 meters was about 6 meters. He sat down on a rock and began to calculate. The power of the water flow is equal to the product of the flow rate, the head, the acceleration due to gravity, and the density of water. 80 liters per minute is about 1.5 liters per second. 1.5 multiplied by 6 multiplied by 9 and 8. That's roughly 88 watts in theory. The efficiency of a homemade turbine is 30% at most, so that's about 25 watts in practice. Not much, very little, but enough for 5 light bulbs. 5 light bulbs is no longer a toy. 5 light bulbs means a lit guardhouse and workshop. He returned to the factory and began sketching in his notebook. A water wheel, the simplest design. An overshot water wheel. Water falls on the blades from above. It turns the shaft. The shaft turns the generator via a belt drive. The generator produces electricity. The electricity flows through the wires. The wires light the bulb. Simple, just like everything in real engineering. The next 3 days were spent on the wheel. Dan cut sheet metal from the casing of a dead unit. He bent the blades. There was nothing to weld with, so he riveted it together. He made the rivets out of nails. He turned the shaft from a steel rod he found in the warehouse. He took the bearings from a bicycle frame. Lena helped. She held the parts. She handed him the tools. She silently watched his every move. By the end of the second week, the water wheel stood in the stream, crooked, bulky, but it turned. Water fell on the blades and the wheel spun. A belt made from a cut-up leather strap ran to the generator. The generator hummed. The meter showed 22 watts. Steady. Round the clock. Dan ran 2 wires from the generator to the guardhouse. He screwed a light bulb into a homemade socket. He flicked the switch made from a piece of tin. The light bulb lit up. Not brightly, dimly, but steadily. No flickering. No flickering. Effortless. It just burned. Lena stood in the doorway and looked at the light. Dan saw her clench her fists, not out of anger, out of something else. She said quietly that in the village she'd run away from, only the village headman had light. A kerosene lamp for which the village paid the guild 2 sacks of grain a month. 2 sacks of grain for a single lamp. Dan said nothing. He looked at his generator. 22 watts from a stream and trash. Free. Forever. As long as the water flows. He thought that 2 sacks of grain a month for a single kerosene lamp wasn't a trade. It was racketeering. Then he thought that the word racketeering probably didn't exist in this world. Then he thought it didn't matter. What mattered was that the light was on. The end of the second week brought 2 events. The first was small. Dan finally fixed the hand pump. He installed proper seals made of fired clay and oiled rope. The well provided clean water consistently. He set up a wooden trough and a drain nearby. Now they could wash. Lena washed herself for the first time since arriving at the factory, and he saw that the burns on her fingers weren't from a kerosene lamp. They were marks from an iron. He didn't say anything. Only the next day did he show her how to use pliers and place the tool in her hands rather than giving her an order. The second event was a big one. On the factory grounds, Dan found a basement he hadn't noticed on his first tour. The entrance was blocked by debris from a brick wall. He spent 2 days clearing it away. Behind the rubble was a staircase leading down. On the first landing stood a steel door. Locked. Massive. With a combination lock. The display flashed. Sub-level 1. Access blocked. Rank C required. Dan stood in front of the door. He placed his hand on it, and he sensed it. There was something behind that door. Not a mechanism, not a generator. Something else. The humming he heard at night was coming from here, from below, from beneath the factory. He took his hand away. He looked at the meter, rank D, exactly 0.8 kilowatt-hours delivered to consumers. Rank C was a long way off, and so far the only consumers were himself and Lena. 1 light bulb in the guardhouse. He needed more. He needed people. The third week changed everything. Dan decided to leave the factory grounds and explore the surrounding area. He walked south along an overgrown forest road. The grid in his head faded with every kilometer. At the 5th kilometer, it turned into a barely noticeable flicker. At the 10th, it had almost vanished. System limitation. The factory was his anchor point. The farther he was from it, the weaker the interface became. At 50 kilometers, he would be an ordinary person, but at the 12th kilometer, he emerged from the forest onto a hill and saw a village below. 15 houses, log walls, thatched roofs, vegetable gardens, 2 wells, a horse hitching post. Not a single electrical wire, not a single streetlight. In the twilight, the village looked like an illustration from a textbook on the Middle Ages. Only the people were real. He saw a woman hanging laundry. He saw children running between the houses. He saw an old man sitting on a porch, carving something out of wood. In the main square stood a pole with a sign. He walked closer. The letters were in the same unfamiliar language as the sign on the factory gates. But the grid, even in its weakened state, translated it. Green Hollow, population 47, registered with the Northern Frontier Energy Guild, service status suspended. Suspended? That word spoke volumes. The guild had stopped serving this village. Kerosene is no longer delivered. The lamps are going out. People are left in the dark. Dan stood at the edge of the village and counted in his head. 12 kilometers to the factory. If he ran the wires through the trees, copper wire from the windings of a dead transformer, the losses over such a distance at low voltage would be monstrous. But if he increased the voltage, if he built a step-up transformer at the factory and a step-down one in the village, 220 volts on the line, 30% loss. That's a lot. But the remaining 70% is light in 15 houses. In 15 houses where children go to sleep in the dark. He turned around and walked back, quickly. Back at the factory, he told Lena he had a plan. She asked what it was. He said he was going to light up the village, the whole thing, every house. Lena looked at him as if he were crazy. Then she looked at the lone light bulb in the guardhouse powered by a 22-watt stream-powered generator, and back at him. He understood her look. 22 watts and 15 houses. The gap was enormous. But he had a factory, and in that factory stood a 200-kilowatt turbine that could be brought back to life. Not at full power, at least 10%. 20 kilowatts. That would be enough for the whole village with some to spare. But for that, he needed steam. For steam, he needed a boiler. For a boiler, he needed fuel, coal, firewood, or... He remembered. In the basement of the repair shop, next to a barrel of motor oil, there were 2 more barrels. Vegetable oil, expired, rancid, but oil. And rapeseed grew near the factory, wild, overgrown, but rapeseed. You can press oil from it, biodiesel. Not from rapeseed, of course. Real biodiesel requires chemicals he doesn't have. But there's an easier way. He could make an oil burner, spray the oil with a nozzle, supply air, create a flame, heat the boiler, get steam. The steam turns the turbine. The turbine turns the generator. The generator produces electricity. The electricity travels 12 kilometers through the wires. Windows light up in the dark. Simple. Dan sat down at the table and started sketching. In the first 2 weeks, Dan built a water wheel on the stream and got a steady 22 watts. He discovered a locked basement beneath the factory requiring a C rank. He found the village of Green Hollow 12 kilometers from the factory and set a goal to light up all 15 houses. To do this, he needed to run a steam turbine on vegetable oil. 1 month, 30 days of non-stop work. Dan lived by a schedule he'd written himself on a scrap of notebook paper and nailed to the wall of the guardhouse. Up at dawn, water, nuts and roots for breakfast, work until noon, lunch, work until sunset, dinner, an hour for notes and calculations, sleep. Lena lived by the same schedule. She no longer asked why. She saw the light bulb that burned every evening from the stream-powered generator. She saw that Dan wasn't lying. He didn't promise what he couldn't deliver. He didn't talk a good game. He just did it. And she wanted to do it too. The boiler was the main problem. The factory boiler stood in the boiler room and looked as if it had been through a war. The piping system was clogged with scale. The shell had 3 cracks visible to the naked eye. Dan placed his hands on the shell and closed his eyes. The scan unfolded. Water tube steam boiler. Operating pressure 16 atmospheres. Current condition critical. Internal cracks 7. External cracks 3. Wall corrosion 40%. Recommendation? Write off. Dan removed his hands. Write off. If he were at his power plant in Ohio, he would have agreed, but he wasn't in Ohio. He was in a world without spare boilers. So he won't write it off. He'll repair it. Not the whole boiler, that's impossible without welding and sheet steel, but one section, the small circuit. If he isolates the damaged pipes and leaves only the intact ones, if he reduces the operating pressure from 16 to 4 atmospheres, if he reinforces the weak spots with wire and clay bandages, then this boiler will produce steam. Not much. Not good. But it will produce some. 4 atmospheres is about 15% of the turbine's rated power, 30 kilowatts. No, less. Taking into account losses and turbine wear, 20, maybe 15. But even 15 kilowatts is a huge number in this world. 15 kilowatts is 350 watt bulbs. 300 bulbs. Dan smiled. He only has one so far. Working on the boiler took 2 weeks. He plugs the damaged pipes. He filled the cracks with a mixture of clay and liquid glass found in the chemical warehouse. He wrapped steel wire bandages around the weakened sections. Every day for 10 hours, he crawled inside the boiler. Cleaning, patching. He checked. The mesh helped. It revealed micro cracks invisible to the naked eye. It showed the wall thickness. It showed temperature fields. But he did the work with his own hands. 300 turns of the wrench, 500 hammer blows, 2 kilometers of wire bands. An engineer's patience, his most tedious and strongest ability, to perform the same action 300 times in a row with the same precision. Lena helped. She had learned to hand him tools without waiting to be asked. She saw that he was reaching his hand and would already place the right wrench in it. Dan didn't praise her, but once he said she had good reflexes and that she'd make a good operator. She didn't ask what a camera operator was. She already knew. The oil burner turned out to be simpler than the boiler. He turned the nozzle out of a copper tube. He assembled the air pump from a bicycle pump. The fuel tank was made from an iron barrel. The vegetable oil burned poorly. It smoked. It's soot-stained. But it burned. He spent 3 days adjusting the oil-to-air ratio in the nozzle. On the 4th day, the burner produced an even blue flame. Not perfect, but stable. He installed it in the boiler's firebox, lit it, and waited. 2 hours later, the pressure in the boiler rose to 1 atmosphere. 4 hours later, to 2. 6 hours later, the needle of the homemade pressure gauge, made from a bent tube and a water column, read 3.5 atmospheres. Dan stood in front of the boiler and listened. The hissing of steam, the crackling of metal expanding from the heat, the gurgling of water in the pipes, sounds he knew by heart, that he had heard 1,000 times. That were like a familiar voice to him. The boiler was alive. For the first time in 22 years, the boiler at this plant was producing steam again. But between the boiler and the turbine stood the steam distribution system. Pipes, gate valves, expansion joints. Half of it was dead. Dan spent another 4 days on the overhaul. He went over every pipe, every joint, every flange. He plugged the dead-end branches. He replaced the gaskets with homemade ones made of oiled felt. He checked the gate valves. 1/3 of them were jammed tight. He took each one apart, scraped off the rust, lubricated them, put them back together. Some still leaked. He wrapped them with wire and smeared them with clay paste. Not up to standard. But it wasn't the Stone Age either. It was progress. By the end of the 3rd week, the steam line from the boiler to the turbine was ready. More precisely, a single route. Straight, no branches. From the boiler, through the main valve, to the right turbine. Dan stood in front of the turbine and looked at it. 200 kilowatts of rated power. Right now, it would produce a maximum of 20, maybe 15. But this would be a real power plant. Not a bicycle generator, not a stream with a wheel. A real steam turbine producing real alternating current. He placed his hand on the frame. The shaft is straight. The bearings are lubricated. 70% of the blades are intact. The generator winding has no brakes. The brushes are new, homemade from carbon and copper, those very ones. Ready. It's ready. He scheduled the start for the morning, not out of superstition. It's just that it's light out in the morning, and if something goes wrong, he'll see it sooner. Lena got up with him. He told her to stand by the door to the machine room, and if she heard a loud bang or saw steam escaping, not toward him but away from the building, to let him know. She nodded. He lit the burner. He waited an hour. The pressure rose to 3 atmospheres. He checked the steam line. Everything was dry, no leaks. He approached the main valve. This was the moment. 10 years at the power plant, hundreds of starts. But this was the first in the new world. He turned the valve handle, slowly, a quarter turn. Steam hissed through the pipes. The turbine trembled. He turned it further, more. The shaft began to rotate, slowly, heavily, with a grinding sound that shouldn't be there. Dan listened. The grinding was coming from the 3rd bearing. He had tightened it yesterday, but apparently not enough. Not critical. The grinding turned into a hum. The hum into a steady roar. The turbine was picking up speed. The grid in his head unfolded completely. Turbine speed, 800 revolutions per minute. Power at the shaft, 12 kilowatts. Generator voltage, 190 volts. Frequency, 48 hertz. Not ideal, but it works. Dan stood in the machine room and listened to his turbine. His own. It hummed evenly and low, like a big, calm animal. He turned toward the door. Lena stood there, her eyes wide open. He told her everything was fine, that the turbine was running, that they had just started up the power plant. Lena looked at the spinning shaft and said she thought it would be louder. Dan laughed, for the first time in a month. By this point, 30 days had passed since his arrival. A single light bulb in the guardhouse had been replaced by 5 throughout the plant grounds. The guardhouse, the workshop, the entrance to the machine room, the warehouse, and one above the gate. Dan had hung it above the gate on purpose, so it could be seen from the forest, a beacon, an invitation. And it worked. On the 25th day, 3 people came onto the plant grounds. A man in his 40s, his wife, and their son, about 10 years old. They had come from a village 20 kilometers to the north. The village had died. The well had run dry. The guild had stopped delivering kerosene 2 years ago. They walked wherever their eyes led them, and they saw the light. At night, far away among the trees, a single light bulb above the gate. The man's name was Thomas Gray, his wife, Mira, their son, Oliver. Dan gave them water, food, a place in the barracks he had cleared out a week earlier. Thomas turned out to be a carpenter. Mira knew how to sew. Oliver could run fast, which was also useful. The next day, Thomas was already repairing the barracks roof, and Dan was showing him how to properly secure the rafters so they could withstand the snow. On the 28th day, 2 more people arrived, an old man and his granddaughter. Then a lone woman with a cart full of some rags that turned out to be books. Then a guy in his 20s with a bandaged arm. By the end of the month, 12 people were living at the plant. Dan didn't ask where they were from. He didn't ask why they had come. He provided water and light and work, to each according to their ability. The tally in his head was growing, slowly, but growing. 43 kilowatt-hours delivered to consumers. Rank C was still a long way off, but the people were already here. And the turbine hummed, and the light bulbs burned, and every evening 12 people sat in the lit barracks and ate soup made from root vegetables found in overgrown vegetable patches, and looked at the light and were silent, because there were no words for it. The second month began with the problem Dan had been expecting from day one: food. 12 people eat a lot. Roots and nuts from the forest had been enough for the first few weeks, but now they needed something substantial. Thomas Gray brought up the issue at the morning meeting. Dan had instituted the meetings the day the group grew to more than 5 people. Every morning, 10 minutes, standing. Who's doing what today? What problems? What needs? Thomas said the land around the factory was good. Black soil. If they cleared the area of brush, they could plant potatoes, turnips, and carrots. Seeds could be found in Green Hollow, bought or traded. Dan asked what they could trade for them. Thomas fell silent. No one had any money. Dan thought for a minute. Then he said they had something more valuable than money. Light. He could fix any kerosene lamp in the village in an hour. He could make an oil lamp out of a tin can and a wick. He could sharpen tools on a homemade grinding wheel powered by an electric motor from a turbine. He could give people what the guild wouldn't: free help. Thomas looked at him for a long time. Then he said he'd go to Green Hollow today. Thomas returned in the evening with seeds and with news. The village knew about the factory. Several people had already seen the light above the gate. Rumors were circulating. The village elder, a man named Marcus Irwin, was wary of the rumors. He was old and cautious. He remembered the catastrophe. He remembered what came before it. And he remembered what happens when people start promising light. The guild had promised once too, and then it started taking 2 bushels meals of grain for a single lamp. But Thomas didn't promise. He simply brought 3 repaired kerosene lanterns and a sharpened axe, for free, from a man at the factory. The village elder took the lanterns. He felt the blade of the axe, and said he wanted to see this man from the factory with his own eyes. Marcus Irwin arrived 3 days later, on foot, 12 kilometers, alone. He was 62 years old and walked for 4 hours. Dan met him at the gate. Marcus stood there looking at the light bulb, then at the wires leading to the machine room, then at the boiler room chimney from which light smoke was rising, then at Dan, and asked who he was. Dan said he was an engineer. Marcus asked which guild he belonged to. Dan said none. Marcus frowned. He said there were no engineers without a guild. Dan shrugged and invited him to take a look. He led the foreman through the entire plant. He showed him the boiler room. He showed him the turbine. He showed him the generator. He explained how oil burns in the nozzle, how steam turns the blades, how the blades turn the shaft, how the shaft turns the generator, how the generator produces electricity. Marcus listened in silence. Sometimes he touched the pipes. Sometimes he leaned down and looked at the joints. He didn't understand the details, but he understood the main point. This man didn't. He didn't pray. He didn't wear the guild's priestly robes. He just worked, with his hands, with tools. And the iron obeyed him. When they returned to the gate, Marcus was silent for a long time. Then he asked if Dan could bring light to Green Hollow. Dan said he could, but not today. It takes time. It takes wires. It takes a transformer. Marcus asked what a transformer was. Dan explained. A device that changes the voltage. It increases it so the current can travel far without loss, and then another device lowers it back down to a safe level. Marcus listened and said it sounded like magic. Dan said it sounded like physics. Marcus smiled for the first time. The village elder was convinced, but convincing him was only half the battle. Now they had to build a 12-kilometer-long power line. No poles, no insulators, no installation crews. Dan started with the transformer. He returned to the substation where the dead power transformer stood. He laid his hands on it. The grid unfolded. A three-phase transformer. Rated power, 100 kilovolt amperes. The high-voltage winding was broken. The low-voltage winding was 60% intact. The core was intact. The core was intact. That was the main thing. Laminated iron, magnetic core. If the core is intact, the windings can be rewound. Dan removed the cover. He spent 2 days dismantling the old windings, counting the turns, writing them down. Then he began winding the new ones. Copper wire from the warehouse stock. Thin, but there was plenty of it. He wound turn by turn, evenly, carefully. One layer, insulation between the layers made of oiled paper. 300 turns. An engineer's patience. Lena sat nearby and watched. On the second day, she asked if she could try. He showed her how to hold the wire, how to lay the turns, how to place the insulation. She began winding, slowly, hesitantly. The first layer came out crooked. Dan looked at it. He said it was fine for a first try. Unwind it and wind it again. She unwound it and wound it again. Straighter. He nodded. On the third day, she was winding it without his supervision. He decided to run the line along the trees. There was nothing to build poles from, no concrete, not enough steel pipes. But the forest between the factory and Green Hollow was dense, and the trees stood close enough together. If he tied the wire to the trunks 4 meters above the ground, it would run through the forest like a vine. Not pretty, not by the book, but it would work. He made the insulators himself, fired clay. He molded 100 of them, small cylinders with a groove for the wire. He fired them in a bonfire. He attached them to the trees with nails and wire. Each insulator took 20 minutes. 100 insulators meant 33 hours of work, 3 days. He pulled the wire himself, a spool of copper wire on his back, a ladder made of poles tied to a tree trunk. He climbed up, tied the wire to the insulator, climbed down, moved on to the next tree, climbed up, tied it, climbed down, and so on for 12 kilometers, 100 trees. He walked this route for a week, 2 kilometers every day. He returned to the factory by nightfall. He collapsed onto the tarps. In the morning, he got up and went again. Lena walked with him. She carried spare wire and tools. She didn't complain, not once. Life went on as usual on the factory grounds. Thomas cleared a plot and planted the first seeds. Mira set up a kitchen in one of the workshops. A woman with books named Ruth began teaching Oliver and 2 other children to read by the light of an electric lamp. A guy with a bandaged arm named Finn turned out to be a former blacksmith's apprentice. Dan put him in charge of the boiler room. He showed him how to check the pressure, how to add oil to the burner, how to monitor the water level. Finn was a quick learner. His hand healed in 2 weeks. Dan didn't ask how he'd broken it. The community was growing. Not quickly, but it grew. On the 35th day, a woman arrived with her 2 daughters. On the 40th, an old man who knew how to cure meat and catch fish. On the 45th, a 17-year-old who had run away from the guild's apprentices. He came at night, quietly. He was trembling, not from the cold, but from fear. He said his name was Isaac, that the guild master beat his hands with a stick for every mistake, that he'd seen the factory lights from the road and decided to take a chance. Dan poured him some tea, hot tea, made from herbs that Mira had gathered in the forest. He sat him down on a chair and said that tomorrow he would show him how the turbine worked, without a stick. Isaac looked at him and didn't believe him. Dan shrugged. He said Isaac would see for himself tomorrow. The line to Green Hollow was ready by the middle of the 2nd month. 12 kilometers of copper wire on clay insulators tied to trees. Dan assembled the step-down transformer in the village in 2 days. A small one, 3 kilowatts. That was all he needed. 15 houses with 100-watt bulbs each is 1.5 kilowatts, with room to spare. He installed the transformer on a pole next to the well in Green Hollow's main square. He ran the wires down the street.
to every house. 15 lines, 15 sockets, 15 light bulbs. He made the bulbs himself. Not from scratch, of course. He found 30 old incandescent bulbs in the factory warehouse, intact, sealed. They'd been sitting in a box for 22 years, waiting. He took 15, one per house. Marcus followed him through the village and watched. The residents watched. Children ran after him. One woman brought him some bread. He took it, said thank you, and continued pulling the wire. He scheduled the connection for the evening at 9 o'clock, when it was completely dark.
Marcus asked, why wait for darkness? Dan looked at him and said that light is best seen in the dark. The rain started at 6 in the evening, light, cold, autumnal. Dan stood in the machine room and watched the turbine. It hummed steadily. 12 kilowatts. Boiler pressure 3 and 5. Steam temperature 140 degrees. Everything normal. 3 indicators were lit on the homemade control panel made of a wooden board. Green LEDs that shouldn't have been there. He'd made them from small incandescent bulbs with colored glass from lanterns. Green meant normal. Red meant a problem. All 3 were green. He looked at his watch. He didn't have a watch, but the grid in his head showed the time, 6:32 p.m. 2.5 hours until connection. He checked everything again. The boiler, the steam line, turbine, generator, step-up transformer at the substation. He couldn't check the line from here, but he'd walked the entire route that morning. All 100 insulators were in place. All connections were intact. The wire wasn't sagging anywhere. The step-down transformer in Green Hollow under the canopy. Dry. Everything was ready. Lena walked into the machine room, soaked from the rain. She said that Thomas and Finn had checked the last 3 kilometers of the line. Everything was fine. Dan nodded. The rain picked up by 8, a real downpour. Water pounded on the machine room roof and ran down the walls where the roof had sprung a leak. Dan held out buckets. Routine. He checked the oil level in the burner, enough for 12 hours of continuous operation. Sufficient. He checked the pressure. Stable. Turbine speed, 820 per minute. Slightly above normal. The rain was cooling the condenser better than usual. Good. He stood at the control panel and waited. Lena stood nearby. She was silent. Finn sat by the boiler and watched the burner. Everyone else was either at the factory in the barracks or already in Green Hollow. Marcus had called the whole village to the square at 9 o'clock in the evening. He didn't explain why. He just said they had to be there. At 8:45, Dan opened the distribution panel. Homemade. Wooden casing. Copper bus bars. A switch made from a piece of steel strip with a wooden handle. 1 switch, 1 line. Green Hollow. He checked the connections. He rang the line with a homemade tester made from a light bulb and 2 wires. The line was intact. Resistance was normal. No short circuits. He returned to the control panel. He looked at the indicators. 3 green lights. He looked out the window. Outside it was pitch black. A downpour. And somewhere out there, 1.5 miles away through the woods, stood a village where 47 people were staring at the dark light bulbs in their homes, not believing they would ever light up. 23 years without electricity. An entire generation raised in darkness. Children who had never seen electric light, old people who thought they would never see it. Dan looked at the clock in his head. 21:00. He walked over to the switch. He placed his hand on the wooden handle. He looked at Lena. She was looking at him. He told her that when he flipped that switch, current would flow through the wires, through the forest, through the transformer, into the village, and a light would come on in every house, and that they had done it, not just him, all of them together, her and Thomas and Finn and everyone who had pulled the wires and wound the coils and molded the insulators. Lena said nothing. She just nodded. He flipped the switch. Click. Silence. The hum of the turbine hadn't changed. The needle on the amperemeter on the control panel twitched and crept upward. 0.5 amps. 1. 1.5. The current was flowing, through the wires, through the night forest, through the rain, through 12 kilometers of copper wire on clay insulators tied to the trees. The current flowed from his turbine to the village that had been waiting for light for 23 years. Dan stood by the dirty window of the machine room, wet, with a streak of fuel oil on his cheek, and he watched. At first, nothing. The black forest, the rain. And then, a single window, far away among the trees, a small yellow rectangle in the darkness. A single window lit up. Then another one next to it, and another, 3, 5. They lit up one after another, as if someone were slowly opening a box full of lights. 7, 10, 12, 15. A lantern over the well, a sign above the tavern. Dan counted. 17 light sources. 15 houses and 2 street lights that Marcus had hung himself last week. All of them were lit. Every single one. He stood there, watching those lights through the rain and the wet glass. And his legs buckled. He sat down right on the concrete floor of the machine room. He leaned his back against the turbine frame, which hummed behind him, warm and alive. And he cried. Quietly. Silently. Because it had worked out. Lena came over and sat down next to him. She didn't say anything. She just sat there. The turbine hummed. In Green Hollow at that moment, people were coming out of their houses, into the rain, out onto the square. Marcus Irwin stood under the streetlight above the well and looked up at the lamp. Water ran down his face. He didn't wipe it away. Women stood in their doorways and looked at their windows, the lit windows. Children ran out into the street barefoot through the puddles and laughed. A boy of about 5 stood under the streetlight and studied his shadow. He had never seen a shadow from an electric streetlight before. Long and distinct. Not like from a candle. Different. He raised his hand, and the shadow raised its hand. He laughed. An old woman brought a book out of the house, a thick one, a worn one. She stood under the streetlight and opened it. She began to read. You could tell by her lips that she was whispering the words. A book she hadn't been able to finish reading for 20 years because there weren't enough candles and her eyes weren't what they used to be. Someone started laughing, then cried, then laughed again. A minute later, the whole square was laughing and crying and hugging each other, and the dogs were barking. And it went on until morning. No one went to sleep. They stood in the rain and looked at the light, at the ordinary electric light they hadn't seen in 23 years. In the morning, Marcus came to the factory. He wasn't alone. 12 people were with him, men and women. They were carrying bread, potatoes, salted fish, smoked meat, honey in clay pots, tools, 2 axes, a saw, a sack of nails. They laid it all out in front of the gate. Marcus looked at Dan and said that the village wanted to help, that they didn't know how his machine worked, but they knew how to chop wood and build houses and dig the ground, and that they wanted to be a part of this. Dan looked at the mountain of food and tools in front of the gate. He looked at the people, at their faces, steadfast, serious. This wasn't the gratitude of beggars. It was an offer of partnership. He said he needed hands, lots of hands. If the village gave him 10 people for 3 months, he'd bring in 5 more villages from the surrounding area. Marcus didn't haggle. He said he'd give 15. The counter in his head flickered, not from watts, from something else. The grid displayed a line he hadn't seen before. Number of regular consumers, 47. Total energy delivered, 214 kilowatt hours. Hours. Trust rating, a new parameter, 72%. The system wasn't just counting electricity. It was counting the people whose lives had improved. The people who had believed. Dan read those numbers and thought the system was smarter than he'd thought. It wasn't measuring power, but meaning. News of Green Hollow spread quickly. In a world without phones or the internet, rumors travel on foot. But they travel fast. Merchants passing through Green Hollow saw the light and told the next village. They passed it on. Within 2 weeks, people within a 50-kilometer radius knew about the plant. They told all sorts of stories. Some said that a sorcerer lived in the northern lands who had tamed lightning. Some said the guild had built a secret station. Some said it was a hoax and that the light would go out in a week. The light didn't go out. Every evening, 15 windows in Green Hollow lit up. Every morning, they went out. Consistently, reliably, like sunrise and sunset. And that frightened people more than any miracle, because miracles pass. But electricity from a well-maintained turbine works for years. 3 weeks later, delegates from 2 neighboring villages came to the plant, Elmwood and Creston. Both settlements were 20 kilometers from the plant, both without electricity, both cut off from the power grid. They asked the same thing: could they have it too? Dan said they could, but it would take time, and wire, and people to do the work. The delegates exchanged glances and said they would provide the people. By the end of the 2nd month, 35 people were already working at the plant. Not all of them lived on the premises. 15 came from Green Hollow every morning and left in the evening. They were learning. Dan was teaching them. 2 hours every day after lunch. Not theory, practice. How to strip a wire, how to make a splice, how to check the integrity of the line, how to change a light bulb. Simple things, basics. But for people who had lived without electricity for 23 years, it was like the alphabet for an illiterate person. A revelation. Lena became his main assistant in class. She remembered everything the first time. She repeated it without mistakes. And she could explain it to others more simply than he could, because she herself had just learned it and remembered where it was difficult. Dan looked at her and thought that this girl with burned fingers would know more than half the guild's masters in a year. And that would be his best work. Not a turbine, not a power line, but a person who knows how and isn't afraid. The screen flashed. Energy. Rank upgraded to C. He stopped in the middle of the lesson, read the line again. Rank C. Foreman. 214 kilowatt hours delivered. 47 regular customers. Access to sub-level 1 unlocked. Dan slowly lowered his hand, which was holding the piece of wire he'd been showing the students. The basement. The steel door. It's open now. Dan connected Green Hollow. 15 houses received electricity for the first time in 23 years. The village became a partner of the plant. 2 neighboring villages requested connections. The community grew to 35 people. The rank was raised to C, and access to the factory basement was unlocked. Dan went down to the basement the next morning, alone. He told Lena he was going to check the foundation. He didn't want to scare her. He didn't want to scare anyone until he saw for himself what was down there. The steel door opened easily. Too easily for a door that had been closed for 22 years. The hinges didn't creak. The lock clicked softly, as if someone had been oiling it all this time. Behind the door was a staircase. Concrete steps led downward, clean, no dust, no debris, no cobwebs. Dan turned on his homemade battery-powered flashlight and began to descend. 20 steps, a turn, another 20. The air down below was cool and dry, like in a good cellar or a server room. The staircase ended in a corridor, a long one, straight. Cable channels ran along the walls, empty but neat, built by professionals. He walked down the hallway and the grid in his head glowed brighter than ever, as if down here it felt at home. The hallway led to another door. This one wasn't steel, but wood. Old, with a simple handle. Dan opened it, and entered the room. The room was small, about 15 square meters. A table, a chair, a bookshelf along the wall. On the shelf were folders, dozens of folders, thick ones, with leather covers. A diary lay on the table, a thick notebook bound in dark leather. Dan sat down at the table. He opened the diary. The first page, the date, 24 years ago, a year before the catastrophe. The handwriting was small and neat. The language was the same as on the sign at the gate, but the translator rendered it instantly, and Dan began to read. The author of the diary was a man named Elias Werner, chief engineer of Facility Number 7, that very plant. Elias wrote that the facility was not being built like an ordinary plant. It was being built as an anchor, a stabilization point in the field that was supposed to envelop the planet. Elias knew about the field. He knew they were going to activate it, and he was against it. He was part of a group of engineers who tried to stop the project, a project they themselves had created. Dan turned the page. Elias described the technical structure of the field. Dan read slowly. He absorbed every word. The field of silence was not a natural phenomenon. It was a machine, a massive one, a distributed one, consisting of thousands of nodes buried all over the planet. Each node generated a wave of a specific frequency. Together, they created an interference pattern that suppressed the operation of complex electrical systems. Simple physics. On a monstrous scale, but simple. And this factory, Facility 7, it was one of the nodes. But Elias had modified it. Before the field was activated, he changed his node's settings. He made it so that within a 50-kilometer radius of the factory, the field was weaker. Not turned off, but weaker. That's exactly why the small generators worked here. That's exactly why Dan's turbine wasn't malfunctioning. That's exactly why the plant drew him here. It was a zone of silence within the field of silence. An island where machines could breathe. Dan read for 3 hours, without looking up. Elias's diary ended 2 weeks before the catastrophe. The last entry was short. Elias wrote that he couldn't stop the activation, that his comrades had lost, that the field would be activated in 14 days, and that he was leaving this diary for whoever came after, because the system was programmed to search for an operator, a person capable of interacting with the nodes, a person with a certain way of thinking and a specific set of skills. A hands-on engineer with a knack for machines. The system will search for such a person, and when it finds him, it will bring him here, to Facility 7, because this is where it can begin. From here, the field can be shut down, node by node. Dan closed the logbook. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the scale of it all. Thousands of nodes, all over the planet. Someone turned them on 23 years ago and extinguished civilization. And that someone did it on purpose. Not a catastrophe, not an accident, a decision. Someone's decision that people didn't need electricity, that the world was better in the dark. Dan sat in the basement and thought. Then he stood up. He took the notebook, he took the 3 folders of blueprints that were sitting on the shelf, and he went upstairs. He didn't tell anyone, not yet. First, he needed to understand more. The blueprints in the folders described the suppression unit, the one that stood beneath the factory. Dan spread them out on the table in the workshop and studied them every evening after everyone had gone to sleep. The unit was complex, but not incomprehensible. A wave generator, a resonator chamber, an antenna system, a power source. All of it operated at the frequency Dan heard at night. A hum. That very same transformer hum. It was the unit. It was working. Right now, beneath his feet, stood a mechanism that had been silencing this corner of the world for 23 years. And Elias had weakened it, but not turned it off. Because he couldn't. He didn't have access. They needed an operator. They needed Dan.
While he was sorting out the basement, life upstairs didn't stop. The lines to Elmwood and Creston were being built simultaneously. 15 people from Green Hollow plus 10 from the 2 new villages. 25 pairs of hands. Dan was in charge. He demonstrated. He explained. Lena led the second crew. She was 16 and she commanded grown men, and they listened because she knew what she was doing and they didn't. The wire was laid using the same method. Trees,
Clay insulators, copper wire. It was 18 kilometers to Elmwood, 22 to Creston. The losses over such distances at 220 volts were significant. Dan recalculated. He raised the voltage on the line to 400 volts. He rewound the step-up transformer at the factory. He made 2 new step-down transformers for the villages. The losses dropped to an acceptable level. The line to Elmwood took 10 days. The line to Creston took 2 weeks. By the end of the 3rd month, 3 villages were lit up in the night forest. Green Hollow, Elmwood, Creston. 78 houses, 193 people. The numbers in his head were growing fast. 1,200 kilowatt hours, 193 regular customers. The turbine was running at full capacity. 12 kilowatts was all the vegetable oil boiler could produce at 4 atmospheres. The 3 villages consumed 8. That left 4 for the factory. Not enough. Dan realized he needed a second source, and he knew what it was. A hydro turbine. The stream behind the plant. Not a small water wheel rated at 22 watts. A real hydroelectric plant. He spent 2 days at the stream.
measured the flow, calculated the head. Upstream, 1.5 miles from the plant, there was a canyon, narrow, rocky. The elevation drop over 200 meters was 12 meters. If he built a small dam and channeled the water through a pipe to the turbine, a flow rate of 80 liters per minute with a 12-meter drop, that's 150 watts in theory. With 50% efficiency, 75 watts. No, not enough. But the stream isn't the only source of water. 2 kilometers to the east, a river flowed, small but with a flow rate 10 times greater, 800 liters per minute. With a 6-meter drop if a diversion channel were built. That's 700 watts in theory. With a good turbine, 400. No, he made a mistake. He recalculated. 800 liters per minute is 13 liters per second. 13 times 6 times 9 and 8. 760 watts, 50% efficiency. 380 watts. Not enough for a power plant. But if the head were the dam higher, if you raise the head to 15 meters, then almost 2 kilowatts. That's something. And if you dam the river completely and create a reservoir, then you can control the flow, and at peak discharge, get 10 kilowatts. Dan stood on the riverbank and drew with a stick in the sand. A dam, a water pipe, a turbine hall, a diversion channel. It was a project that would take months. But it was a real project. A second generator, a second source, independent of oil, free, eternal. As long as the river flows. The 4th month brought Kan So. She arrived in a cart accompanied by 2 guards wearing Energy Guild armbands on their sleeves. Short, round glasses held together with wire. A blue coat, neatly patched in 3 places. She introduced herself as an inspector from the Guild's northern branch. She said she had come to inspect an illegal power plant. Dan stood at the gate. He looked at her. He looked at the guards. He said the tea would be ready in 10 minutes. Hannah blinked. She had expected hostility, fear, attempts to hide the equipment. Not a trace. The guards exchanged glances. Dan turned and walked toward the guardhouse. Over his shoulder he said that if they wanted to see the plant, he would show them everything. He had nothing to hide. He showed her around for 2 hours. He showed her the boiler room. He explained how the vegetable oil burner worked. He showed her the turbine.
He explained how steam turns the blades. He explained the difference between active and reactive power. He showed her the generator. He explained how the rotor creates a magnetic field and how the stator winding converts it into alternating current. He showed her the transformer substation. He explained why voltage needs to be stepped up for long-distance transmission. Not once was he condescending. Not once was he patronizing. He spoke to her as a colleague, as an equal. Hana listened. At first, with professional skepticism, then with growing surprise, then with something resembling pain. Her father was a guild master, of high rank. He knew all this, knew about transformers and generators and turbines. And he burned his blueprints before he died, personally, in the fireplace, so that the knowledge wouldn't fall into the wrong hands, into the hands of people without a guild license. Her father believed that light should belong to the chosen few. This man with fuel oil on his cheek believed that light should belong to everyone, and his turbine worked better than anything Hana had seen in the guild's workshops. The guards left that evening. Hana stayed. She said she needed more time for the inspection. It was a lie, and they both knew it. She stayed because she couldn't leave. Because for the first time in her life, she saw what her father had been so afraid to give to the people. A working power plant in the hands of a man without a patent. And the world didn't collapse. The villages didn't burn down. People didn't turn into savages. They simply read books by lamplight and washed dishes in warm water. On the second day, Hana sat in on a class Dan was teaching for the villagers. He explained how a simple switch works, a circuit breaker, a contact, and a spring. 20 people listened with their mouths agape. Hana listened too, and when he finished, she raised her hand and asked if she could help with the training. She had experience. She had worked as a teacher in a small town for 3 years before the guild appointed her an inspector. Dan looked at her. He said the school needed a principal. If she wanted the job, it was hers. Hana took off her glasses. She wiped them with the hem of her coat, put them back on, and said she wanted it. School started a week later. A desk, a blackboard made from a piece of plywood painted with soot. 6 teenagers. Hana wrote the schedule. Literacy and arithmetic in the morning, electrical engineering basics after lunch, practical work in the workshop in the evening. Lena was the oldest student. Isaac was second. The other 4 were children from Green Hollow. Dan led the practical sessions. Hana taught the theory. They worked side by side and complemented each other. He provided the hands-on guidance. She provided the words. He showed how to do it. She explained why. In the evenings, they sat in the guardhouse and planned the next day. He sketched, she wrote. Sometimes they argued, calmly and to the point. Dan said that theory without practice is emptiness. Hana said that practice without theory is danger. Both were right, and both knew it. The 5th month. Construction of the hydroelectric plant was in full swing. 30 people were working on the river. They were digging a canal to divert the water. They were hauling stones for the dam. Dan drew the design on the blackboard at school and explained every element. A 4-meter-high dam, a water pipe 30 centimeters in diameter made of riveted sheet iron, a turbine hall on the bank below the dam. He assembled the turbine himself, not from factory-made units. Those were too big. He built a new one, from scratch, from a steel disc, from blades cut out of sheet metal and welded to the disc. He assembled the welding machine from a factory transformer. Primitive. AC arc welding. Electrodes made of steel wire coated with clay and graphite. Not perfect, but he welded seams that held. Lena stood nearby and watched. On the 3rd day, he gave her a mask and an electrode. She laid the first seam. Crooked. Dan looked. He said it was fine for a first try. Clean it up and weld again. She cleaned it up and welded again. Straighter. By the end of the week, she was welding on her own. In the middle of the 5th month, Abigail Wright arrived at the factory. Redhead, freckled,
with a canvas bag full of jars and bundles of herbs. 3 workers had been poisoned by poorly purified oil that had accidentally gotten into the drinking water. Vomiting, dizziness, fever. Dan didn't know what to do. He was an engineer, not a doctor. Abby appeared as if she'd heard him. She came along the forest road, humming something under her breath.
She saw the sick workers. Without a word, she laid out her jars on the table, a bark decoction, a mint infusion, a compress made of some kind of leaves. 2 days later, all 3 were back on their feet. Dan asked where she had learned this. Abby fell silent. For the first time since he'd known her, then she said quietly that her mother had been an herbalist, and that the village had burned her mother at the stake when Abby was 12. For witchcraft. For healing without a guild license. Dan was silent for a long time. Then he said that no one gets burned at the factory, and that he needed a medic. She stayed. A week later, Dan set aside a room for her in the administrative building. He put in a table, shelves for vials, electric lighting, and a sterilizer, a simple one, a metal tub with a lid on an electric hot plate. The water was boiling. The instruments were being sterilized. Abby stood in front of that tank and said nothing. Then she looked at Dan and said that her mother had dreamed of something like this, a place where people could be treated openly, without hiding, without fear. Dan said that now there was such a place, and that there would be a sign on the door. Clinic. Abby laughed, through her tears, and said she wanted a sign with a light bulb. Dan said there would be a light bulb. 6th month. The hydroelectric plant is ready. A dam made of stone and clay blocked the river. The reservoir filled up in 2 weeks. A water pipe ran from the dam to the turbine hall. The head was 14 meters. The flow through the turbine was regulated by a gate valve. At maximum, 10 kilowatts. Together with the steam turbine, that's 22 kilowatts. Enough for 10 villages. Dan started the hydro turbine in the morning in front of the whole community. 40 people stood around the small building on the riverbank and watched as the water roared through the pipe and spun the steel disc. The generator hummed. The meter showed 9 8/10 kilowatts. Steady. The people clapped. Someone shouted that Dan was great. Dan grimaced and said that the river was great here and he had simply installed a wheel. No one believed him. The 7th month. The guild was no longer silent. First Inspector Hana arrived and did not return. A second inspector was sent 2 weeks later. This one was different. A middle-aged man with a stern face and 2 assistants who wore knives openly on their belts. He didn't ask for tea. He presented a document, an official order from the northern branch of the Energy Guild, illegal operation of energy equipment, a demand to immediately cease the supply of electricity immediately and hand over all equipment to representatives of the guild. Signature. Seal. Dan read the document, folded it, put it in his pocket, and said he was inviting the inspector to lunch. The inspector said this was not a courtesy visit. Dan said lunch was ready and that after lunch he would show him around the plant. The inspector exchanged glances with his assistants. The assistants placed their hands on their knives. Minju Park stood 10 meters away from them. She had appeared at the plant 2 days ago, tall, calm, with a scar across her eyebrow. She stood as if she were part of the wall, but Dan saw how she looked at the assistants, appraisingly, professionally, like someone who knows exactly what she can do to 2 armed men if necessary. Minju arrived at night, without explanation. She placed a pistol on the table in front of Dan, an old one, a guild pistol, with engravings on the grip, and she said she needed a job. Dan asked where she was from. Minju said she was from the guild, that she had been a mercenary, that she had been sent to watch the factory, and then to clean it out. Dan asked why she hadn't cleaned it out. Minju paused. Then she said she'd been watching him from the hill for a week. She saw him dragging a wire through the rain at night to a house on the outskirts of Green Hollow. In the house was a woman with a sick baby. The child was dying of cold. Dan hooked up a heater, a homemade one, a nichrome wire coil on a clay base. The child survived. Minju saw it from the hill through a telescope, and she decided she wouldn't kill a man who dragged wire through the rain to save someone else's baby. Dan looked at the gun on the table, then at her. He said she should keep the gun, and that he needed someone to be in charge of security. Minju nodded. The inspector left empty-handed. Dan showed him the station, showed him the school, showed him the clinic. He showed him the village. The inspector saw lights in the windows and children running down the lit street, and an old woman reading a book under a streetlight. He didn't say a word the whole time. When they returned to the factory, he took the paper from Dan's pocket. He tore it up. He got on the cart and drove away. His assistants left with him. Minju watched them go and asked Dan if he understood that the next ones wouldn't be coming with papers. Dan said he understood. The 8th month, Soyeon Choi came to the factory with her father. Her father was a blacksmith from Green Hollow, a big man with heavy hands and a quiet voice. He brought his daughter and told Dan that she wanted to work, that she had been deaf since birth, but that she had golden hands and sharp eyes. Dan looked at Soyeon. She was looking at him, without looking away, directly, without shyness. He noticed that she was standing barefoot on the concrete floor of the machine room, and that her toes were twitching slightly, as if she were listening to something, with her feet. He asked her father if Soyeon knew sign language. Her father said she knew a little. She and her mother had learned the basics when she was little. Dan turned to Soyeon and motioned for her to follow him. She followed. He led her into the machine room, to the turbine. The turbine hummed at operating speed. Dan pointed at the floor, then at the turbine, then at Soyeon. She understood. She stood closer to the turbine, barefoot on the concrete. She closed her eyes and opened them a minute later. She walked over to the right bearing. She placed her hand on the housing. She looked at Dan. She gestured. "This one. Bad. It'll break soon." Dan checked. The sensor confirmed it. The 3rd bearing, the very one that had groaned during the first startup. 70% wear. Replacement in 2 weeks at most. Soyeon determined this in a single minute while standing barefoot on the floor, through the vibration, through the floor, without instruments, without the grid. Dan looked at her, then at her father, said she didn't need a job. She needed a position. Chief diagnostician of the machine room. Soyeon's father blinked. He looked at his daughter. Soyeon stood straight and looked at Dan. For the first time in her life, her deafness was called not a disability, but a tool. 9th month. 10 villages are connected to the grid. The population of the service area is 320 people. 50 people live and work at the factory full-time. The school has grown. 12 students. Hana teaches 5 subjects: literacy, math, physics, pre-war history based on books from Ruth's library, and sign language. The last subject was added after Dan said at the morning meeting that Soyeon couldn't teach sign language to everyone, and that if they wanted to work as a team, they should learn the basic signs themselves. No one objected. A week later, the entire shop knew 30 basic signs. Yes, no, stop, go, pressure, temperature, normal, dangerous. Soyeon walked barefoot through the shop and used her fingers to indicate the status of each unit. The workers understood. They responded. For the first time in her life, Soyeon was at the center of communication rather than on the periphery. Her father came to the plant once a week. He stood in the doorway of the machine room. He watched as his daughter commanded 2 adult operators by the turbine, and he left in silence, with tears in his eyes. The sabotage occurred at the end of the 9th month, at night. Someone cut the wire on the line to Elmwood in 3 places, professionally. The village went dark. Dan found out at dawn when Finn ran in from the boiler room with a report that the load on the line had dropped to 0. He walked the route and found the cuts. Clean, with a hacksaw. Not the wind, not a fallen tree. A person. Minju examined the tracks around the area. 2 people, guild-issue boots. They came from the southeast. They left the same way. Dan repaired the line in a day. He put in new splices, wrapped them with oil-soaked cloth tape. Elmwood lit up again that evening, and the next morning, a villager stood by every pole along the line, with a pitchfork, with an axe, with a lantern. Marcus organized this without a single word from Dan. The villagers had come out on their own to guard their light. Dan stood on the road and watched this chain of people along the line, and he realized that these were no longer his wires. They were their wires, and that the guild was too late. The 10th month. Dan went down to the basement again, but this time he wasn't alone. He took Hannah with him. Of all the people at the plant, she was the only one educated enough to understand Elias's blueprints, and honest enough not to go mad over what they meant. He silently placed the diary and 3 folders in front of her. Hannah read for 4 hours. Dan sat across from her and waited. When she looked up, her face was pale. She said that if this was true, then the guild wasn't just a monopoly. The guild knew. At least the top brass did. They knew the field was man-made. They knew it could be weakened. They knew where the nodes were. And for 23 years, they had used that knowledge not to help people, but to hold on to power. Dan said he wasn't sure the entire guild knew. Most likely only the leadership, the magisters of the inner circle. Hannah took off her glasses, wiped them, put them back on. She said her father had been a master of the high circle. Dan said nothing. Hannah closed the journal. She placed her hands on the table and said she now understood why he had burned the blueprints, not out of greed, out of fear. He knew the field was man-made, and he feared that if someone started to shut it down, the one who turned it on would come back and do something worse. Dan asked who had turned it on. Hannah shook her head. There was almost nothing about it in Elias's diary, just hints. Someone from the other side, a group, an organization, with capabilities no engineering team had possessed before the catastrophe. Those who built thousands of suppression nodes and buried them all over the planet. They went upstairs. Dan called a small meeting that evening. Hannah, Minju, Lena. Kate hadn't arrived yet. Abby was on duty at the clinic. He told them everything, about the diary, about the nodes, about the field, about how the catastrophe wasn't an accident but a decision. Lena listened in silence. Minju listened in silence. When he finished, Lena asked what difference it made. They'd still be pulling wires. They'd still be setting villages on fire. What difference did it make who turned off the lights if they were turning them back on? Dan looked at her. She was 16, and she had just said the most accurate thing anyone could have said. Minju added that it would make a difference when the one who turned it off found out that someone was turning it back on, and that they needed to be prepared for that. The 11th month, 18 villages connected. The population of the service area is 600 people. Dan has been declared an illegal operator by the guild, officially, by name. With a description, with an order to all masters and inspectors to detain him upon discovery and turn him over for trial. A copy of the order was brought by a merchant passing through Green Hollow. Dan read it. He smiled. He hung it on the wall in the workshop. Marcus came in and asked if he wasn't afraid. Dan said he was afraid, but that fear was no reason to turn off the lights. Marcus nodded and left. And 3 days later he returned with news. The village council had gathered, 12 elders. They decided that the factory and the lines were under the protection of the community. Any attempt to damage the infrastructure would be considered an attack on all the villages at once. Dan asked how many people they had.
Marcus said that 600 people is 600 people, and that everyone has an axe. Dan thought for a moment and said that an axe is good, but it would be better if they learned to repair the wires themselves. Marcus smiled. He said there was a school for that. The second act of sabotage. This time, it was serious. Not the wires, the water intake. Someone had crept up to the dam on the river at night and tried to plant a charge in it, a primitive one.
Gunpowder in a barrel with a fuse. Minju found the barrel before the fuse burned out. She put it out. Then she found the man. 2 kilometers downstream. He was running, badly, limping. Minju caught up with him in 10 minutes, brought him to the factory. A young guy, about 25. Not a guild member, a mercenary. He was paid 5 silver marks. For what? To blow up the dam. Who paid him? A man in the city. He didn't give his name, but he spoke like a master, with that distinctive guild accent you can't fake. Dan let him go. Minju asked why. Dan said that if they started locking people up, they'd become the very thing they'd run from. Minju looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was either very smart or very stupid. Dan said it was more likely the latter. The end of the 11th month. Kate Noel. She appeared like a bolt from the blue, tall, straight back, a gray strand at her temple, a guild master's ring on her finger. She was walking, alone. No security, no luggage, just a drawing case on her back. Minju spotted her from the observation post and sounded the alarm. Kate stopped at the gate. She waited. When Dan came out, she said in an even voice that her name was Kate Noel, that she was a third-rank master of the Energy Guild, that yesterday she had been ordered to poison the plant's water intake, that she had refused, that she had been stripped of her rank, and that she had come to work. Dan looked at the ring on her finger. Kate caught his gaze. She took off the ring, put it in her pocket, said she no longer needed the ring, but wouldn't throw it away. 20 years of work is 20 years of work, even if the system is rotten. Dan nodded. He said he respected that, and that he needed a technical director. During her first week, Kate walked through the entire plant, every unit, every wire, every connection. She made notes in her notebook, she counted, she sketched. On the third day, she came to Dan with a sheet of paper listing 42 points, 42 observations about his work, from improper grounding in the boiler room to the lack of overload protection on the lines. Dan read the list. Every point was correct, every single one. He looked at Kate and said she was the first person to argue with him on a... Kate said she wasn't arguing. She was stating facts. Dan smiled, and they started working, together, in the evenings, when everyone else had left. 2 engineers poring over blueprints, Dan with his practical experience and intuition, Kate with her systematic thinking and guild training. They argued every evening, about wire gauge, about insulation methods, about protection circuits, and every evening they found a solution that was better than either of them could have found on their own. The 12th month, a year. Dan stood on the roof of the engine room and looked south. Night. Clear. The stars were bright and alien. But over the course of a year, he had grown accustomed to them. Below, both turbines hummed, steam and hydro. 22 kilowatts, 18 villages, 612 people to whom his electricity provided light and heat and the opportunity to live differently than their parents had. The grid in his head displayed a map, a small one. The plant in the center, lines radiating outward, the dots of the villages. Each dot glowed a soft green. Connected. Working. He ran his hand over the map. He remembered every line, every pole, every insulator, every house at the end of a wire. He knew that in Green Hollow, Marcus had hung a new lantern over the school because the children had started staying to read after sunset. He knew that in Elmwood, Ford the blacksmith had put an electric motor on his grindstone, and now sharpened knives in a minute instead of an hour. He knew that in Creston, Mira, an elderly woman who knew how to embroider, could see the pattern in normal light for the first time in 20 years. Every kilowatt was registered to him. Rank B. The grid showed it a week ago. Chief engineer of the plant. The interface had deepened. Now he could see not only the status of the machinery upon touch, but also from a distance. Within the plant, he could sense every operating unit, every light bulb in every house connected to his grid. Like a spider at the center of a web. Only his web carried not death, but light. And more. He sensed a node beneath the plant, distinctly. The hum was no longer background noise, but a voice. He was beginning to understand its frequency, its rhythm, its logic. Elias had weakened this node but hadn't shut it down. Because he didn't know how. Dan was beginning to understand how. Master Victor Hale arrived at the end of the 12th month. Not in secret, openly. In 3 wagons, with a guard of 10 men, with the guild's flag. Marcus had sent a messenger with a warning 2 days earlier. Dan was waiting. Minju stationed lookouts along the perimeter. Kate stood next to Dan at the gate. Hale stepped out of the wagon, 60 years old, gray-haired, thin. The tired eyes of a man who has slept 4 hours a day for 30 years. A master's ring on his finger, a cane in his hand, not for show. His leg hurt. He looked at the factory, at the boiler room chimney, at the wires leading into the forest, at the light bulb above the gate. Then at Dan, and said he wanted to talk, one-on-one. They sat in the guardhouse. Dan poured tea, mint, from Abby's stash. Hale took a sip. He grimaced, not at the taste, at the situation. He began to speak, in an even tone, without threats, without grandstanding. He told him that he had become a guild master at 25, right after the catastrophe, that he'd seen the world collapse, cities burning, people killing each other over a candle, that the guild was created not for power, but for survival. That the first masters were engineers, just like Dan. That they gathered what still worked from the rubble and brought it to the people. But then fear set in. Fear that if knowledge spread, someone would break something again, that the world would collapse again. And the masters decided it was safer to keep knowledge locked away, in a caste, under control. Hale said he'd believed in this for 30 years, that every order he'd given, including the order to eliminate Dan, had been dictated not by malice, but by the conviction that uncontrolled light was a time bomb. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. When Hale fell silent, Dan stood up. He walked to the window. He looked at the lights of the villages in the darkness beyond the forest. And he asked how many villages had gone dark in the last year because of the guild. Hale answered quietly. 17. 17 villages were left without power because the spare parts ran out and the guild couldn't produce them. Dan turns to him and said that he wasn't a bomb, that his students weren't bombs, that a 16-year-old girl who knows how to wind a transformer coil isn't a threat. This is the future. And if the guild wants to be part of that future, it needs to stop being afraid and start learning. Hale was silent for a long time. Then he pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket. He unfolded it. It was numbers. Dan's grid capacity, the number of consumers, the efficiency of his turbines, line losses. Hale had studied all of this before arriving, through his agents, through observers, and the numbers told him what he didn't want to hear. Dan's grid was working, stably, for a year, without a single serious failure. Nothing had burned out, no one had died. The lights stayed on, and the world didn't collapse. Hale stood up. He walked over to the table. He took off his master's ring. He placed it on the table in front of Dan, and he said one word. Teach. Dan looked at the ring, then at Hale. He picked up the ring and placed it back in the old man's palm. He said he didn't need his ring.
He needed his knowledge. He needed the blueprints the guild kept. He needed masters who were willing to teach, not hide. Hale stood with the ring in his open palm, looking at a man half his age, and for the first time in 30 years, he didn't know what to say. Then he slowly slipped the ring back on and said he would give Dan a list of masters who thought the same way he did. There weren't many of them, but they exist. A year has passed since Dan's arrival. His rank has been raised to B. Master Hale came personally to speak with him, and after a late-night conversation, he took Dan's side. He promised to pass on the contacts of the dissenting masters of the guild. 18 villages are now consistently connected, the 13th month. The split in the guilds began quietly. Hale kept his word. 2 weeks later, 3 masters arrived at the factory. Each carried a tube containing blueprints. Blueprints that the guild kept in safes and released only with the master's personal authorization. Generator schematics, coil calculation formulas, material resistance tables, maps of ore deposits in the northern region. Dan laid out the blueprints on a table at the school and didn't leave the room for 2 days. Kate was with him. They compared the guild's data with what Dan knew from his own world. 90% of it matched. The remaining 10% consisted of differences that could be explained by technological variations. Before the catastrophe, this world had developed along a different path. Neither worse nor better, just different. Steam mechanics were at a higher level than in Dan's world. Electrical engineering was at a lower level, but the fundamentals were the same. Ohm, ampere, watt, Kirchhoff's laws, Maxwell's equations. Physics is the same across all worlds. The 4th master arrived not with blueprints, but with 30 people. Apprentices, students, young men and women who had spent 20 years studying in the guild's workshops and had never seen a working power plant. Because the guild no longer built plants. The guild repaired the old ones. And even that it did worse and worse. The apprentices looked at Dan's turbine with an expression he had already learned to recognize. A mixture of delight and pain. Delight that it worked. Pain that they had been taught incorrectly for 20 years. Dan didn't feel sorry for them. He put them to work at the machines, gave them tools, and said that in a month, each of them would assemble a generator, from scratch, with their own hands. 30 generators. 30 future power plants for 30 villages. The school attached to the factory tripled in size. Kana reorganized the schedule. Morning groups, afternoon groups, evening groups. 3 streams. Children from the villages, apprentices from the guild, adult residents who wanted to learn at least how to change a light bulb and fix wiring. Lena led the hands-on classes for the younger groups. She was 17, and she was teaching 20-year-old guys how to make a proper twist. And they listened, because she did it better. Isaac became the workshop's senior master, the very same boy whose hands had been beaten with a stick. Now his hands were the most precise in the factory after Dan's. He wound the coils with such precision that Kate, after checking his work, said she hadn't seen anyone better in her 20 years in the guild. The 15th month. The Northern Network, officially. 25 villages, 800 people, 3 power plants. The factory plant, the hydroelectric plant on the river, and the new one. A small wind turbine on a hill 4 kilometers from the factory. 2 kilowatts, not much. But it was the first power plant built entirely by the students without Dan's involvement. He came to the opening. He stood in the crowd, not on stage. Lena flipped the switch. The windmill spun, the generator hummed. The lights on the poles flashed on. The village of Haywood became the 26th in the grid. Dan stood in the back rows and watched Lena. She stood by the switch, tall, thinner, with tanned hands and calluses from tools. Not like that skinny girl with burned fingers who had come to the gate a year and a half ago. She looked at him through the crowd. He nodded. She didn't smile, but her eyes were shining. The 16th month. Dan started a project for a new power plant.
Not from rubble, not from trash. A new one, from scratch. Designed, calculated, built according to all the rules that he and Kate knew. They chose a site at the confluence of two rivers, 20 kilometers from the plant. A 20-meter drop, a flow rate of 1,000 liters per minute, an estimated capacity of 50 kilowatts. It was more than everything he had built in the past year and a half combined. Kate drew the blueprints. Dan checked them. They argued, every evening, over the calculations, over the tolerances, over the thickness of the water conduit walls. Kate insisted on a threefold safety margin. Dan said that was a waste of material. Kate said that was better than an accident. Dan looked at her and thought she was right, and that this was exactly why he valued her, for not being afraid to argue with him. They worked through the night by lamplight in the workshop. Two engineers, two loners who found each other over the blueprints. Kate would sometimes take off her glasses and rub the bridge of her nose. In those moments, she looked not 30, but 20. Tired, beautiful, and not thinking about it at all, only about the tolerances. Construction began. 100 people. For the first time in the history of the Northern Network, a construction project was on this scale. Stone for the dam, iron for the turbine, copper for the generator, wood for the formwork. Dan was in charge. Kate oversaw quality control. Hana organized logistics. Minju ensured safety. Abby treated injuries. Soyeon diagnosed equipment. Lena led the installation crew. Everyone in their place. Everyone irreplaceable. Dan looked at them and thought that a year and a half ago, he had been alone in the wet leaves. And now, he had a team. And that was worth more than any generator. 18th month. 30 villages in the grid. 1,000 people. 4 power plants. A factory steam plant. A hydro plant on the stream. A wind plant on the hill. And a new hydro plant at the confluence of the rivers. 53 kilowatts of total capacity. The school graduated its first 12 students who received electrician certificates from Hana. Not a guild license, just a simple sheet of paper with Dan and Hana's signatures and a list of skills. But that sheet of paper meant more than any guild ring, because it was backed by real skills, not rituals. Each of the 12 could lay a line on their own, wind a transformer, assemble a generator, repair a turbine. They scattered across the grid, 2 to each district, to maintain, to repair, to teach the next ones. Dan stood on the school porch and watched them leave. Backpacks with tools, coils of wire, and in every backpack, a notebook with notes that Hana had written by hand and that Lena had copied into 12 copies. The 19th month. For the first time, Dan went more than 50 kilometers from the plant. He wanted to check. The grid began to dim at the 40-kilometer mark. At the 50th, it became barely visible. At the 60th, it went out completely. He stood on the road, 60 kilometers from the factory, and was an ordinary man with a wrench in his pocket. No interface, no backlight, no metal detection, just Dan Crow, an engineer from Ohio. He turned and walked back. And at the 55th kilometer, he noticed something strange. The silence was reacting. The field he was used to hearing as a background hum grew louder when he moved in a certain direction, and grew fainter in another, as if something were tracking him, or as if the field knew where he was. He stopped, turned east. The hum grew louder, turned west. It weakened. To the south, almost silence. To the east again, a hum, distinct, lingering, as if a second node was calling him. Dan memorized the direction. He returned to the factory. He took out the map Kate had compiled from the guild's data. He drew a line to the east. After 120 kilometers, the line ended at a marker, an old industrial district, an abandoned city. Object unknown. On the guild maps, it was marked with a red cross and an inscription. Zone of absolute silence. Do not enter. Dan looked at the map and thought. The second node. He can feel it. And the node feels him. The 20th month. The expedition. The first beyond the factory's sphere of influence. Dan, Minju, Lena, Kate. 4 of them. A small group. Fast. Inconspicuous. On sleds because it had snowed. They were heading east. Dan's grid went dark at the 50-kilometer mark. He was driving blind, relying on his senses, on a hum that only he could hear. Minju led the caravan. Kate recorded the coordinates using the compass. Lena kept track of the supplies. On the 3rd day, they came upon the ruins of a city. A huge one. Dead. Buildings jutted out of the snow like rotten teeth. The streets were buried, not a single living creature. Absolute silence. And a hum, deafening to Dan. He sensed the node. It was here, beneath the city, more powerful than the one beneath the factory, operating at full capacity, unweakened. It was this one that maintained the silence for hundreds of kilometers around. They found the entrance to a bunker beneath the building that had once been the town hall. A staircase leading down, steel doors, corridors. Everything was just like under the factory, only on a larger scale. Dan led the way. The grid wasn't working. He followed the sound. The hum, which grew louder with every step down. And he found it. A chamber, a large one. A machine in the center. It looked like a generator but wasn't a generator. A resonator, an antenna array, a power supply. Everything was working. 23 years without a break, autonomously, maintenance-free. Dan placed his hands on the casing, and even without the grid, he could feel it. The machine was simple, brilliantly simple. An oscillating circuit in resonance with the Earth's field. It suppressed electromagnetic processes within a specific frequency range, precisely the range in which generators, motors, and transformers operated. Simple and monstrous. Dan stood before this machine and thought. He could turn it off, right now, open the circuit, pull out the power supply, and silence would fall over this city and for hundreds of kilometers around. But he didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how many nodes were in the network, didn't know how they were connected, didn't know if the one who turned them on would react. He took his hands away. He looked at Kate. She understood. He said they would come back, prepared, with a plan, with an understanding of the entire system. Kate nodded. Minju nodded. Lena didn't nod. She stared at the machine and clenched her fists. She wanted to turn it off right now. Dan placed his hand on her. He said that patience is also a strength. She looked at him, unclenched her fists. They left. The 21st month. Dan returned to the factory with new knowledge and new fear. He knew that the nodes could be shut down, by hand, without a system, without rank, just break the circuit. But he also knew it would be like pulling teeth from a sleeping dragon. Sooner or later, the dragon would wake up. He had to understand the entire network, all the nodes, their locations, their connections, and find the one who activated them. Elias's diary hinted but didn't spell it out. The group, an organization, pre-war, with resources that surpassed the capabilities of any nation. They decided the world had gone too far, that technology was destroying the planet, and they pressed the button. A philosophy of destruction disguised as salvation. Dan understood the logic. He didn't accept it, but he understood. Someone decided for billions of people that they didn't need electricity, didn't need hospitals with equipment, didn't need refrigerators for medicine, didn't need light for reading. Someone decided that darkness was safer. Kate proposed a plan. Systematic, methodical, just as she knew how. To map out all known zones of absolute silence, based on guild data, on traders' accounts, on rumors. Each such zone is a potential node. If we find them all, understand the layout, pinpoint the central node, the one on which the rest depend, and shut it down, then the entire network would collapse with a single move. Dan looked at her and said that it was beautiful in theory, but that the central node was surely guarded, and that whoever had activated the system 23 years ago was most likely still alive, and most likely knew that someone was poking around in his machines. Kate said that was exactly why they needed to act quickly. Minju said that you can't have speed and safety at the same time. Hana said that before breaking the system, we need to make sure the world is ready for what comes next. What will happen when the silence falls? 23 years without technology, an entire generation. They don't know what to do with electricity. They'll be like children with fire. Dan listened to everyone, and they were all right. The 22nd month. He made his decision. No global operation, no strike on the central node. Instead, expansion. Slow, methodical. Village by village, region by region, school by school. Every liberated area receives not just electricity, but knowledge. People who understand how it works, who can fix it, explain it, and teach others. By the time the silence finally falls, the world must be ready. Not an empty world waiting for a miracle. A world in which every village has someone who knows what a generator is. Kate called it a strategy of sprouting. Hana called it education. Lena called it justice. Minju didn't call it anything, but she nodded. Meanwhile, Dan continued to study the node beneath the factory. Every evening, he went down to the basement, alone. He sat down in front of the machine and listened. The B-rank grid allowed him to see the node's structure in detail. The oscillation generator, the resonator chamber, the antenna array, control unit. He was figuring it out, slowly, piece by piece, just like he'd once taken apart the turbine upstairs. Only here, the stakes were different. A mistake with the turbine meant a dark night. A mistake with the node meant the unknown. After a month of studying, he realized one thing. The node wasn't just a suppressor, it was a transmitter. It didn't just generate a wave, it received a signal. From somewhere, from the central node, or from whoever was controlling all of this. And that signal contained information, coordinates, commands, data on the field's status. Dan couldn't decode the signal, not yet, but he could see that it existed. Someone was still controlling the network. Someone was watching. Someone was checking that all the nodes were working. And when Dan weakened the field around the factory, when he set the villages ablaze, that someone surely noticed. The 23rd month. News came from the south. A merchant from a distant caravan reported that strange rumors were circulating in the capital, 1,000 kilometers from here. Someone at the court of the supreme master of the guild was concerned that points on the map were fading in the north. Points that do not appear on any official maps. Points that are visible only on one map. The one hanging in the windowless office. Dan listened to the merchant and felt a chill run down his spine. The map of nodes. Whoever activated the system has the map, and they can see that node number 7 is weakened, and that lights are burning around it. Minju said that meant they had time, but not much. Whoever controls the system will come in person sooner or later to see what's going on. Dan nodded and said that by that point, they should have enough people and knowledge that it wouldn't matter, that the best defense against the person who turned off the lights is a world where everyone knows how to turn them on. The 24th month. 2 years. The northern network comprised 35 villages and settlements, 1,400 people, 6 power stations, 12 school graduating classes, 72 certified electricians, 3 mobile crews that traveled the network and maintained the lines, a postal service, trade routes, shared grain warehouses. The village council met once a month. Marcus Irwin was its chairman. Dan wasn't on the council, on principle. He was an engineer, not a politician, and he wanted the network to be able to survive without him. Because sooner or later, he would have to go far away, to the central hub, and maybe never return. The 25th month. Winter again. Dan's second winter in this world. The snow lay deep and white. The power lines bent under its weight, but held. The clay insulators he had molded in the early months had long since been replaced with porcelain ones. The factory workshop now mass-produced porcelain insulators, 20 a day. A small assembly line, a small operation, but production nonetheless. Not repairing the old, but creating the new. Kate was behind this project. She said that infrastructure without standardization is chaos waiting to happen. And she was right. Every element of the grid now had a number. Every line had a marking. Every station had a passport. Bureaucracy. Boring and necessary. Like bearings in a turbine. You can't see them, but without them, nothing turns. The 26th month. Expeditions headed east and south. Small groups of 3 or 4 people. They searched for nodes, plotted them on the map. In 6 months, they found 4 more, all in abandoned industrial zones, all operational, all of the same design. Dan didn't shut them down, he studied them. Collected data, recorded frequencies, compared them, and gradually pieced together the picture. The nodes weren't placed at random. They formed a network, a geometric one. Each node at a specific distance from its neighbors. The waves from them combined into a single field covering the entire planet. If one node were removed, the field would weaken locally, just as he had seen around the factory. But if the central node, from which the control signal originated, were removed, the entire network would lose synchronization. The field wouldn't disappear instantly. It would begin to disintegrate, slowly, region by region, like ice melting in spring. That was important. Not a sudden shutdown, not an explosion, not chaos. A gradual awakening. A world that slowly remembers how to be a world. The 27th month. Dan found it. The central node, not on the map, in the signal. He sat in the basement beneath the factory and listened to the transmission. Headphones made of copper wire and a diaphragm from an old telephone. A primitive receiver with a crystal detector. The signal was coming from the southwest, constantly. A pulse every 60 seconds. The coordinates could be calculated based on the delay between reception at different nodes. He drove to the 2 nearest nodes and took measurements. Then he calculated. A week. With pencil and paper. Trigonometry. Wave propagation speed. Time difference. Result? The capital. Or an area near it. The central node was located in the capital, where the person who ran the system lived. Dan looked at the point on the map and felt everything falling into place. A windowless office, a map on the wall, a man watching his dots fade away. He was in the capital, and Dan knew where. But before heading south, there was one matter to settle in the north. Ashford, a small mountain village, cut off from the world by snowstorms, 20 years without contact with anyone. Dan had heard about it from a merchant. 53 people living off the land. No kerosene, no candles, nothing. On winter nights, with 18 hours of darkness, they sit in their homes and wait for dawn. The children in Ashford didn't know what a lamp was, not even a kerosene one. Dan made a decision. The 30th settlement in the network would be Ashford. The connection would be made on the longest night of the year, the winter solstice. Preparations took a month. The road to Ashford went through a mountain pass. In winter, it's only passable by sleigh. The transformer was transported in parts, wire on spools, insulators in boxes. Minju led the caravan. Kate managed logistics. Hana coordinated communication with the villages along the route. Abby assembled a medical supply kit in case of frostbite. Soyeon checked every piece of equipment with her hands and feet. Literally. every transformer, every generator, every coil of wire. Her diagnosis was more accurate than any instrument. Lena commanded a 10-person installation crew. She was 18. She installed lines faster and cleaner than any guild master, and she knew it, and she didn't brag, because Dan had taught her that good work needs no advertising. The caravan set out in early December. 6 sleds, 20 people, 30 kilometers of wire, 2 transformers, a box of light bulbs. They traveled for 4 days, through a snow-covered forest, over a pass where the wind knocked them off their feet, through a gorge where they had to cut a path through the snow. On the 3rd day, the runners on the sled carrying the transformer broke. Dan lay down in the snow beneath the sled and spent 2 hours repairing the mount with his bare hands because he couldn't feel the bolt. When he stood up, his hands were white and wouldn't bend. Abby rubbed them for 20 minutes. She cursed. Dan endured it. On the 4th day, they reached Ashford. The village stood in a valley between 2 mountains, small, quiet. Smoke from the chimneys, and not a single light. The residents came out to meet them, silently, cautiously. The head of Ashford, a woman named Alice Marshall, looked at the caravan and didn't understand what was happening. Dan walked up to her. He said he'd brought light. She looked at him for a long time. Then she asked if it was for good. Dan said it was forever. The installation took 3 days. They ran the line from the nearest grid point down the mountainside, 30 kilometers, in the freezing cold, in the snow. People worked 6-hour shifts. Dan worked 12. Not because he didn't trust the crew, because he couldn't stop. His hands ached, his back ached, but every insulator screwed onto a pole was a step toward the goal. Lena led the 2nd crew from the other end. They were moving toward each other. They connected the line on the 3rd day, in the morning, at the pass. A 3-turn twist, insulating tape made of oiled cloth. Lena looked at Dan across 10 meters of wire. He nodded. She nodded. The line was ready. The transformer was installed in Ashford Square, next to the well, a pole, a street light. Wires running down the street, to every house. 53 people stood and watched. Children huddled close to their parents. They didn't understand what was happening. They had never seen wires, never seen light bulbs. To them, they were just strings and glass balls. Dan went from house to house, screwing light bulbs into sockets, checking the connections. He pulled the last few feet of wire. Every house, every kitchen. He asked the residents where they needed light. Someone pointed to the table where the family eats dinner. Someone to the corner where the child sleeps. An old woman pointed to the armchair by the window. Dan asked what for. She said she had been knitting her whole life, but for the last 10 years she hadn't been able to because she couldn't see the stitches in the dark. Dan hung the lamp right above the chair, low, so the light would fall on her hands. The old woman touched the glass bulb of the lamp with her fingers, gently, as if it were a living creature. December 21st, the longest night of the year. The sun set at 3 in the afternoon. Darkness fell over the valley like a curtain. No moon, no stars, clouds, frost. Dan stood in Ashford Square. Everyone had gathered around him, the whole village, his entire team. Lena stood by the circuit breaker on the distribution panel, a tablet with readings in her hands, homemade, a wooden frame with dial gauges. Hana stood next to the list of houses, checking that everyone was ready, that all the windows were closed, that everyone was inside. Minju at the edge of the square, eyes into the darkness, out of habit. Abby was handing out hot tea from a thermos. Soyeon was crouching in the snow, barefoot, hands on the ground. She was listening. Through the frozen earth, through 30 kilometers of cable. She could hear the hum of the turbines at the plant, far away, faint, but she could hear it. She looked up at Dan. She gestured. Ready. Kate stood by the backup control panel, the backup system. Her idea. If the main switch fails, the backup will work. She looked at Dan, nodded. Midnight.
Dan looked at Lena. She was standing by the switch, 18 years old, senior machine room operator, master installer. The person who, a year and a half ago, had pedaled a bicycle generator and cried because a light bulb was lit. He told her that this was her connection, not his. She had laid this line. She deserved to flip the switch. Lena looked at him. Her eyes shone in the darkness. She didn't say thank you. She turned toward the switch, placed her hand on the handle, and flipped it. Silence. 1 second. 2. Then somewhere in the darkness at the edge of the square, a transformer sighed. A low, soft sound, like a sigh. And the lantern above the well flashed to life. Yellow, warm, bright against the backdrop of absolute blackness. People gasped. One voice, then 10, then everyone. The windows of the houses began to light up one after another. 53 people were looking at the light, many for the first time in their lives. Children were shouting and pointing. A woman with a baby in her arms stood in the doorway of her house, and the light from the window fell on her face, and she just stood there, not moving. A boy of about 7 ran out into the square and stood under a streetlight. He raised his hands. He looked at his shadow on the snow. He laughed. The old woman for whom Dan had hung a lamp above the armchair stood in the doorway, holding a ball of yarn and knitting needles. Ready. For the first time in 10 years. The town crier, Alice Marshall, stood next to the well, silently. She looked at the lantern. Then she slowly sat down right in the snow, as if her legs had given out. Not from weakness, from something greater than weakness. And then it happened. Dan felt it before he saw it. The hum beneath his feet changed. Not in Ashford. Deeper. Further. The node beneath the plant 100 kilometers from here. It shifted. Changed frequency, as if responding to something. The grid in Dan's head, which had been running on minimal power here in the mountains, suddenly flared brightly, brighter than ever, and produced a line he hadn't seen before. Resonance. Activation of the 30th consumption node. Critical mass reached. Local field deactivation initiated. Dan froze. Local deactivation. He looked up. The clouds over Ashford were moving, parting, as if someone were pushing them apart with their hands. And through the gap in the clouds, moonlight poured in, bright, white, pure. But not only that, behind the moon were stars. Ordinary stars, but different. Not those dim dots he saw every night in this world. Bright, clear, alive. Like in his world. Like in the sky over Ohio. And between the stars, Dan squinted. A thin white trail stretched between the stars. A contrail. One that couldn't be. One that hadn't been seen in 23 years. One that meant that somewhere high above this valley, the sky had become the sky again. The field receded. Not everywhere, only here, above Ashford, above a small patch of the world 10 kilometers wide, 30 connected settlements, 1,400 people who had received the light. Critical mass. The system decided that this piece of the world deserved freedom. Because here were people who knew what to do with light, who weren't afraid of it, who had learned to create it themselves. The field didn't just suppress technology. It was searching. For 23 years, it had scanned the world, looking for the moment when people would be ready. And that moment had arrived. Here. Now. In the small square of a mountain village on the longest night of the year. The people in the square were looking up at the sky. No one understood what had happened. They had only seen that the stars had grown brighter, and that a strange white streak had appeared in the sky.
But Hana understood. She stood there, tears streaming from beneath the glasses she was pressing against her forehead with both hands. Minju understood. She was smiling, for the first time in years, widely, openly, without a shadow. Soyeon understood. Without turning her head, she reached out into the darkness and found Dan's hand. Her fingers were cold from the snow. Dan squeezed them. Kate stood at the control panel and watched the gauges. The needles trembled, not from overload, from something new, from energy that flowed not only through the wires. Lena stood by the switch she had just flipped on and looked at the sky, and the light, and the people, and her hands were not trembling from the cold. Abby was quietly singing something, to herself, as always when she didn't know what to say. Dan stood in Ashford Square. Lights were burning all around him. Stars were burning above him. His people stood beside him. Each in their own place. Each one irreplaceable. Each one having found here what they'd been searching for their whole lives. Lena found that she wasn't a tool, but a person. Hannah found that knowledge didn't have to be burned, but could be shared. Minju found that her opinion mattered. Abby found that her gift is a profession, not a sentence. Soyeon found that her difference is a strength, not a weakness. Kate found that you can start life over at any age. And Dan found that one person with a wrench can change the world. Not with magic, not with force, not with an army. With patience, knowledge, and a light bulb hung at just the right angle. Somewhere far to the south, in the capital, in a windowless office, a man stood before a map of the world. The dots on the map glowed with an even red light. All except one. One dot in the north had gone out. A small patch of the map had gone dark. The field had lost control of Ashford. The man stared at that dark spot for a long time. Then he slowly walked over to the window. Outside the window was the city, dark, without a single light, just like the whole world. Just as he had wanted 23 years ago. He looked north, toward where, 1,000 kilometers away, a mountain village glowed with lights on the longest night of the year. He couldn't see those lights, but he knew they were there, and he said into the empty room in a quiet, steady voice, "So you found me. Well, hello." Then he stepped away from the window, sat down at the table, opened a folder of documents, and began to read. Because now, he had a job too. And in Ashford, no one was sleeping. Until dawn. Lights were on in the windows. A lantern burned above the well. Stars shone in the sky, which, for the first time in 23 years, was real. And Dan Crow sat on the porch step of the smallest house in the village. He held a mug of mint tea in his hands. He looked at the light bulb in the window across the way. An ordinary incandescent bulb, 60 watts, a tungsten filament, a glass bulb. Nothing special. And he thought that this was why he was here. For this warm yellow light in a stranger's window. For the child who had stopped being afraid of the dark. For the old woman who was knitting again. For the boy who was laughing at his own shadow. For that. For all of that. And that tomorrow he would get up, shake himself off, finish his tea, and move on. Because 30 villages is just the beginning. And ahead lies the whole world. Dark, waiting, ready to wake up. And it needs light. Ashford was connected on the night of the winter solstice. The 30th settlement became a critical point, and the field of silence retreated locally over the valley. For the first time in 23 years, the sky above Ashford became real. The person managing the system learned about Dan. The first arch is complete. The northern network is operational. The team is assembled. Ahead lies the path to the central node and the liberation of the world.